Professor Nausheen Anwar, who's the co-director of the network, who's going to say a little bit, I think, reflecting on the South Asian experience as well.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking all our wonderful speakers who've just done such an amazing job in sharing their reflections and sharing their wonderful slides with us. So I'm a South Asianist, so and it's such a steep learning curve for me to listen to our colleagues from different parts of Africa talk about climate change, climate adaptation, and urban violence issues. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly, I have a few minutes and I don't want to hog the space because we should move on to a more open sort of forum for discussion. One thing that really strikes me based upon our speakers' talk so far is that whether we talk about African cities or South Asian cities, and I will say this, Jola, that in the Asian context, there is a great deal of disparity and deviation in terms of talking about Asia as one region, and then South Asia, yet another very complex terrain with the India-Pakistan dynamic, and then the Afghan-Pakistan, the war on terror and all of that, that really splits apart how we think about Asia. Hardly, it doesn't quite cohere as one homogenized entity at all. So when we start thinking about learning from the Asian context, we have to also think very carefully, which context are we referring to, right? Because the South Asian context can be quite different from, say, Southeast Asian or otherwise. But I hear you, and I completely agree with the points that you've made. So one of the things that hits me immediately are these underlying commonalities of these overlapping intensities of different crises that are unfolding in different temporal moments that makes the issue of coherence particularly challenging, whether it is about South Asian cities or Asian cities in general or African cities. So we see this whole dynamic of different kinds of crises or disasters, whether these are urban flooding or what Patrick calls the rain bomb. Karachi just experienced an absolutely devastating period of urban flooding earlier this year. And when some of you, in the Khartoum situation, and also I believe it was Patrick who was showing us some slides, and I was thinking, my goodness, I mean, this completely, totally resonates. It could be Bombay, it could be Mumbai, it could be Karachi. And of course, then the question of resilience, of recovery becomes very much about the bricks and mortar of everyday inhabitation. The question of livelihoods, the question of housing, and whether we talk about slums or informal settlements, which generally speaking in those moments when then the state or local government systems or provincial or federal government systems react, and I think many of these policies are reactive, rather than proactive or with some foresight. And I think that's very much across the board in terms of the cities that all of you have talked about, and in terms of the South Asian cities that some of us are familiar with. What we see is then the most vulnerable get sort of sidetracked. In Karachi now, we have a $6.8 billion US dollar transformation package that is being unrolled by a securitized state, military backed. So in this context, who gets to reap the benefits of that kind of a massive package, which is about ecological transformation and infrastructural uplifting, is a very, very controversial and deeply troubling issue, because it's immediately apparent that in a city like Karachi, and generally a securitized state like Pakistan, which has histories of violence, it was born out of a very violent situation. And, something that Dr. Utere highlighted, the question of state violence is something that is part of the DNA of modern states. And I really do believe he's spot on. Then sort of we see a very top-down, very centralized form of doling out rescue packages, right? So where do we look for those opportunities or those possibilities of solidarities? For us over here in South Asia, sitting in Pakistan specifically, becomes a specific challenge. Now, on the question of solidarities, what I find just absolutely fascinating about the African context, and and when I look, for instance, at my South Asian context, and I look at these fraught fissures between India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, there still is some kind of regional solidarity in the African region. And I really do not find that in the South Asian context. It's very hard for us as Pakistanis to reach across to our Indian colleagues to talk about climate change unless we're of course meeting in very different kinds of forums, in international forums, where we might connect, but most of the time we can't connect. Communities can't connect, right? So vulnerable populations can't connect. Activists find difficulty connecting because if you try to connect, you might be labeled a traitor or you're not patriotic and so on and so forth, because these histories of state violence are so specific to this context. So despite the problematics that each one of you has and challenges that you've cited, I am very emboldened by the fact that in the African region, there is still an element of solidarity that is so markedly different, and really I do celebrate it, even though I realize the challenges and understand the depth of and context of those challenges. And finally, two last points, right? The question of the rural-urban link that Jola highlighted, so important, again, in the context of cities in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, how the dynamic of displacement then in the rural context also then impacts the urban context. So we see, for instance, the degradation of the Indus River Basin in the province of Sindh, where Karachi is located, and the displacement that this has caused in terms of the decimation of livelihood systems and local fishing industries and agricultural livelihoods, and sort of the move towards not only big metropolises like Karachi, but many, many other cities that are typically called small towns or middle-sized towns, which have their own massive sort of degradation of infrastructures and environments to deal with. And we haven't even actually started to look at that. And then finally, the last point that I wanted to just highlight is, Jola had touched on it, is this whole issue of not just land grabbing, but green grabbing, which I think has become particularly worrying. And we see it happening in the Pakistan context, in the Indian context also, where the desire or the impetus to kind of, or the rush, I should say, the desire for speedy infrastructural developments that are green infrastructures for energy production, massive solar parks, massive, wind energy projects, eventually go and rest or find their resting place on the expropriation of land that are common property resources. So we find in the Pakistan context and also the Indian context the displacement of pastoral communities who are generally not even on the radar of policymakers, development agendas or the agendas of development practitioners. And pastoral communities are very much at the forefront of climate change risks. So I think there are these cross-cutting dynamics that are very, very similar. At least this is what I'm seeing, and I'm very emboldened by this conversation. And I just wish that we were all sitting face to face. And I hope that we get a chance to do that in what I hope will be very soon a post-COVID situation. Thank you.